Hi folks, I apologize if this makes for a bit of a jarring transition here, but I'd kind of got cut off on the original attempt at recording the second part to my Warhammer review. So now that I'm re-recording, I'm in a bit of a different environment, as you can see, and so I apologize for that, but I'm just going to try and jump right back into it. In the first part, I pretty much completed just a general overview of what Warhammer Fantasy is, and the general mechanics for how the game works, most of the elements that make up your character, as well as careers, and how careers influence the abilities that your character acquires, and how your character advances in the game. And at the very end of that last part, I started to kind of segue into combat. And combat will be the next subject that we'll be talking about. It's probably one of the, it's probably the first subject that's brought up whenever people generally are talking about Warhammer Fantasy, in that, just like the game itself, the setting itself is generally considered to be dark, dirty, and dangerous. The combat mechanics specifically reinforce this idea that combat is not something to be entered lightly. And I started mentioning how characters have pools of wound points, and you start with a certain number of wound points generated during character creation, and that number very rarely, if ever, changes. Some of the more physically demanding careers, as I mentioned, can accumulate a couple of additional wounds above their starting levels, but they change very little over the course of a character's advancement. And so your character, then, generally speaking, doesn't get significantly tougher as they improve, in the sense that they have a greater narrative buffer against being taken down by enemies. There are a couple of ways that your character can basically toughen up and can face more difficult opponents, or kind of mitigate some of the threats of lesser opponents as they increase, but it's nowhere near kind of the advancement that you would see in a game like Dungeons and Dragons. There is no just like regular incremental increase in your wounds. There is, you can kind of, as your toughness attribute increases, there's a derived attribute from toughness called your toughness bonus, and your toughness bonus is basically it subtracts from the damage that you take from a given attack. And so if your toughness attribute increases significantly enough, it might increase your toughness bonus by 1 or 2 points. It's never very significant, but it can kind of make the difference from time to time. And so that is one way that, despite the fact that characters generally have pretty static wound numbers, that's how you can represent that tougher characters can generally take more punishment than weaker characters or less hardy characters, because their toughness bonus kind of buffers the damage that they take. In the same way that armor works, armor in Warhammer is not treated like difficulty to hit, like armor class in Dungeons and Dragons. Armor actually provides a damage reduction bonus. And there are two different styles of the armor system. You can either use basic armor, which is you have a flat armor value that's considered to cover all locations on your body, and in which case you wouldn't really roll for hit locations in combat. Or you can use the advanced options, and which treats every one of the 6 different hit locations with a different level of armor, different armor value based on what you're wearing. So in the basic armor system, say if you're wearing a suit of chainmail or something like that, and you would just be considered to have 2 points of armor covering your entire body. It doesn't matter where the attack lands. It just protects you in all capacities. And then in the specific armor system, like the location-based armor system, you might have a chainmail shirt, so you have 2 points of armor on your torso, and it might also cover your arms, so you get 2 points of armor on the arms. And then you're wearing a leather cap, so maybe it gives you 1 point of armor to your head, etc. But one of the things that makes Warhammer combat so different and dangerous in its own right is the critical hit system. So the wounds themselves work just kind of like hit points do in D&D and most other games, and that there's nothing intrinsic about losing wound points. There's no penalties that accumulate like in a wound level type of game, say like World of Darkness. But what they do mean is that once your character has reached 0 wounds, and if you take additional damage beyond that, you have to make a roll on a critical hit table. Now, as I mentioned, the critical hit tables are based on location, so you do need to know, and it's a very simple system that Warhammer uses to determine where what location you're hit. Because even if you're not using the optional rules for location-based armor, you do need to kind of track location in terms of criticals. And the critical tables vary based on location, and like generally speaking, critical hits to the head are much worse than critical hits to the arms or the legs. But so the way that you would determine hit location is it doesn't require any additional rolls or anything like that, which is kind of one of the things I like about it. In that all you have to do is remember generally all of your rolls in Warhammer are percentile based, including your attack rolls using your weapon skill or your ballistic skill. So whenever your attack hits, all you do is you invert the digits on your percentile dice, and that tells you hit location. So say if you rolled a 41 to hit with your weapon attack, you would just invert the 4 and the 1, and then 41 becomes 14. Then you would look on your character sheet, which details what a 14 means in terms of where the attack lands. And then so at that point, then you can apply armor against the damage, and then whatever damage gets through, if it triggered a critical hit, you would roll on that location's critical hit table. So the criticals run a pretty big gamut. There are very minor, almost you can't call them inconsequential, certainly, but basically kind of inconveniences that can happen to you, like getting knocked in the head and it dizzies you and it gives you a penalty to certain skill rolls for so many rounds, and then eventually goes away, or and then there are kind of moderate criticals, which are kind of lasting effects. They're hindering, they're inconvenient, but they're not immediately life-threatening or anything like that. You could have bones broken, or you could have an attack that makes you drop your weapon, or something like that. Or something that might need medical attention or needs some time to heal after the combat, but that otherwise isn't going to really threaten the longevity of your character. And then there are severe criticals on the lower ends of the table, or I suppose the upper ends of the table rather, that could mean significant and sometimes even permanent effects that will afflict your character, which could include things like having a hand chopped off, or severe limbs broken, like ribs shattered and things like that, or even things as severe as having a major artery severed, and then you're basically prone to blood loss. So you have to make checks every round to avoid falling unconscious from blood loss and eventually even dying from losing too much blood. And then at the very, very top of the scale, there are even instant death criticals. So there are criticals, like getting your head lopped off, or being pierced through the heart, or something like that. And in fact, the very top line item of each of those critical tables, like the very last result, like the very worst result that you could roll, would be that it actually says you are killed in whatever fantastic and gruesome fashion the game master decides. And so they, generally speaking, the more damage that you take beyond 0 wound points, the more severe the effect that you're going to wind up with on the critical tables. So it's not just purely random when you roll on these tables. It's the worse the hit is, basically the further into negative the attack would have driven you, the more severe the critical effect. And so there are no negative wounds in Warhammer, so you don't accumulate negative hit points or negative wound points as people continue to attack you. Rather, it's basically treated on a hit-for-hit basis. So when you're reduced to 0, the next time something hits you, or even, say, an attack reduced you to 0 and there was still more damage that you had to absorb, you basically count how many points past 0 the damage would take you, and that tells you on a table where you should be rolling in order to determine the criticals. So it is a very dangerous system, and it has the the consequence of, in my personal opinion, generally positive consequence of making player characters and making the players themselves be very cautious about combat. Not basically just jumping into fighting at the drop of a hat. They'll have to think beyond the reach of their sword, and think about the consequences. And even if even in scenarios where it might be relatively minor enemies, and they might feel fairly confident that they could take them on, but they have to understand, even against a goblin with a rusty dagger, if that goblin gets in a lucky hit, it could actually create a pretty bad scenario. It could create a pretty crippling wound for one or more of their party members, and so they have to be willing to take that risk. And I like that. I think combat should be risky. Now, the game system itself and the designers admit that none of us like to kill players. I'm not a GM that likes to be a party killer, because it kind of ruins the fun. It kind of, you've got a group of adventurers, and they've been doing their thing, and they've been advancing. The players have been getting invested in them, and they're pursuing this story. And then you don't want just kind of random die rolls to ruin the fun and somebody get, randomly killed by a goblin with a rusty dagger. But so what the system itself does to kind of mitigate this and to kind of give a little bit of a cushion to the players, to give them a little more staying power, to let them hold on to those characters that they cherish, there is a mechanic called fate points. And fate points, you have X number of them, and they are basically not a replenishing resource. You have X number of fate points, generally 1, 2, if you're very lucky you might have 3. And when you use them, they're gone. But what fate points do is that any time your character would be affected by a drastic, like a maiming critical, or even an instant death critical, you can spend a fate point. And this is kind of represents the fact that your characters are kind of they've got the hand of fate on their backs, like they've got the blessing of the gods or whatever it is. They've got a greater destiny that they're pursuing, and these fate points can be spent to basically sidestep one of those major catastrophes, one of those potentially character-ending criticals, and say to the game master, okay, I don't want my character to be seriously maimed or die, but here you go. I'm going to spend a fate point, and you can kind of put me into a bad situation. That won't mean death, but it will basically mean an inconvenience for me. Like I could be, you could be captured, or you could be poisoned, and then you're in a coma until the party can come along and kind of like wake you up. Or it could even basically generate other plot hooks, like you basically get knocked unconscious, and you have some kind of like a really ominous dream portent that might lead you onto another subplot, or might lead you into, generally in a bad way, but not in a way that is immediately going to end the life of that PC. So it creates a complication rather than or a subplot, rather than just completely ending that particular player and that particular character's involvement in the adventure. So there are resources to do that, to kind of deal with the fact that the combat's very lethal. The other is that you also have fortune points, and fortune points are kind of your action points, your drama points, and you can spend them to gain a reroll on a particular skill or attribute roll, or to gain, I think, an additional action in combat, or like an additional parry during your round, or during your opponent's attack. And so there are a couple of little things that the game does give the players, to give them just a little bit of an edge, to make sure that they know that the game is still dangerous and they still have to be careful, but that they've got a couple of resources to kind of help them out when they're really in dire straits. And so that's what I really love about the game. What I really appreciate about it is that you can still be dark and gritty and dangerous and a little cold to the players, because they do have a little something on their side that will help them out when they really need it. But they know that they can't really depend upon those wholeheartedly, because For one, again, the fate points are very rare and very hard to come by, and you can sort of acquire them, but it's supposed to be a very intensive, very lengthy type of process for characters to replenish or acquire new fate points. The fortune points generally, you're given a certain allotment per day. It's actually equal to the number of fate points you have. So the more fate points you have, and yes, when you spend fate points, it reduces your fate point total, which also reduces your fortune point total. But generally the fortune points, you kind of get them every day, so you have 1 or 2 or 3 chances to kind of make up for some bad rolling during the course of an adventure. It's a very good system, a very intensive system. The magic system I should talk about a little bit, very briefly. There's something called Tzeentch's Curse, and as I mentioned in my setting overview, the Tzeentch is the god of, or is the changer of ways, the god of magic, the god of change. And so it's kind of understood that, and as I mentioned in the setting again, that all the energy, the magical energy that wizards are manipulating are basically the winds of chaos. They're chaos energy. And so as such, whenever a wizard is manipulating this energy, they put themselves at significant risk. They might be able to pull off some really impressive spells, but whenever they do so, they are basically toying with their own fate and the fate of those around them. And so the magic system is basically based off of a single D10. It's one of the only systems that does not use the percentile dice of the core mechanic. So you have a magic trait that ranges from 1 to like 4 at the very high end for like a high level wizard lord. But for a general apprentice wizard, you're going to have like 1 d10. For a journeyman wizard, when you improve your magic attribute, you'll have 2 d10. And you roll these, and you add all the d10s that you can roll together, and you're going against a target number for the spell that you're trying to cast. So the more difficult, the more powerful the spell, the higher the casting number. You can roll up to your magic attribute in d10s in order to do this. And so you say up to. Why would you ever want to roll less than the maximum number of dice that you're allowed if you're always trying to roll over a difficulty number to successfully cast your spell? Well, that's because of Tzeentch's Curse, which I mentioned a moment ago. Anytime you roll doubles, triples, quadruples, whatever it is on the dice, you trigger a chaos backlash. And the severity of the backlash depends upon how many multiples you roll. So if you roll doubles, you get a minor chaos backlash. If you roll triples, you've got a moderate. And if you roll quadruples, you get a major chaos backlash. And again, it's kind of on like a percentile table. So it's almost like magic criticals. So it's like magic critical failures. And so you roll a result on the appropriate level of severity, and you determine what bad thing happens to you and potentially to the people around you due to kind of the misfire of this chaos energy. Now, it doesn't always mean that your spell fails. In fact, your spell might go off just as normal, but there might be other significant consequences that happen to you. Sometimes they're very fleeting and temporary and just kind of an inconvenience, and sometimes they are permanent changes, or basically they tinker with what you were attempting to do with the spell. You could accidentally blast one of your friends with the spell instead of the intended target, or the spell basically the energy kind of like surges back at you and inflicts damage on the caster, or any number of other bizarre effects, causes temporary mutations or even permanent mutations to the caster. And so magic is not something to be toyed around with, and so the wizards in Warhammer can wield a lot of power, but they do so at great risk. So it's just another one of those elements that reinforces the dark and dangerous nature of the Warhammer world, and that nothing is really reliable. The clerical casters, kind of the divine casters, the priests and whatnot of the various gods, don't have that same they don't have quite the same risk because they're not necessarily dealing with chaos energy, and so they don't risk backlash. There's no Zinch's curse for priestly casters, but they do have to be careful because there is basically you couldn't really call it maybe a backfire table, but there's a table which represents how you can kind of excuse me, that you can kind of basically your god can kind of come back at you and say you're asking me for too many favors, or you know, basically it's a little element to give a little bit of uncertainty to the divine casters as well. They're using a similar system. Again, they have a magic trait. They roll d10s and add them up against the difficulty number of the spell. But there is kind of like a little divine intervention table whenever you roll doubles and triples and whatnot on that. So divine casters aren't 100% safe either, though they're generally safer than the arcane casters. So the system is a lot of fun. It's pretty basic, but it runs smoothly, it runs quickly, it gets out of the way, and it reinforces just kind of like as I said, the dark and dirty nature of the setting, in that you know, you're really kind of down in the gutter, just fighting for scraps, and you know, every day is dangerous, every combatant is dangerous, every spell is dangerous, so I enjoy the game a lot, and I'm hoping that I can get to run it again, because it's been on my mind, and I actually just recently kind of picked up a number of the additional material and conversions for the old Enemy Within campaign for 2nd edition. Well, rather, the Enemy Within campaign was written for 1st edition, but I've picked up a number of conversions and information to run it in 2nd edition, which isn't that much of a difference. It's just a few statistics that had to kind of change based upon the updates that they made to the new version. So I hope it was informative. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope there are some of you who are interested and go check out the 2nd edition of the game. I highly recommend it. And I'm going to be going into my 3rd edition review as soon as possible, and I will kind of contrast what the games do and what I think some of the strengths of the 3rd edition are and some of the weaknesses, and kind of give you a sense for how both games play off of each other, and what's you know, where you might fall in terms of your preference for, you know, if you don't like flat probability percentile systems, well then maybe you might like the dice pool system that 3rd edition offers, or, you know, if you don't like all the fiddly bits and everything with 3rd edition, then, you know, maybe 2nd edition's a bit more of a streamlined, straight up pen and paper type of game for you. But I think I own both of them. I think both of them are great, and so I'll just kind of offer a little insight into what 3rd edition has to offer, and see if anybody agrees with me, disagrees with me. I'm sure there's probably going to be lots of debate about that, because it's a pretty hotly debated RPG right now. So anyway, thanks for listening, and I will talk to you guys again soon.